do you pronounce your last name?
It's pronounced Basiago, like Chicago.
Okay, Basiago. And do you have a website that people can look at as you're talking?
Yes, my truth campaign related to the fact that the U.S. government developed time travel, actually many different forms of time travel, by 1970 is at projectpegasus.net. I've named my truth campaign for the actual U.S. government time travel program that I served in as a child back in the late 60s and early 70s. In particular, I would draw your listeners to my growing feature, which is called The Annals of Project Pegasus, where I'm publishing occasional papers about my experiences in Project Pegasus.
Okay, thanks. That's fantastic. You talked about quantum time travel, and there's some aspects of time travel that I did not have the concept of, even though I've studied this. So I was wondering if you could tell us about the Pegasus project and the significance of it.
Right. I was mentioning quantum access as distinguished from time travel. Of course, the term quantum teleportation is being used in our time to conceal the fact that 40 years ago the U.S. government achieved time travel. The quantum teleportation that's being spoken of today is where you disintegrate a human being or other thing that's being teleported at the point of embarkation and then reintegrated at the destination. Unfortunately, that would kill human beings, and it also obscures the different forms of time travel and of technical remote viewing that I'm placing under the broader terminology of quantum access. Project Pegasus, which achieved at least 8 forms of quantum access that I've been able to go back and recall my experiences with, was a classified defense-related research and development program that emerged in the mid-1960s in this country. And its purpose was to develop sources and methods to perform remote sensing in time on behalf of the U.S. President, the U.S. intelligence community, and the U.S. military. And so it wasn't a time travel program per se. Many of the forms of time travel that they were working with had already been developed. It was, in fact, an intelligence project. The purpose was that by gathering better intelligence about past and future events, the executive branch of the United States would be better prepared to engage in contingency planning for future events. And I was one of the 140 American school children that were officially brought into Project Pegasus in the fall of 1969. When I was a third grader, I was, I think, the second youngest child in the program. So we're talking about a cadre of Americans who were born between, let's say, 1957 and 61 that served in this secret defense project. And at this point, I've spent 10 years investigating my experience. I have hundreds of facts to share to prove the historicity of the project, and so that's what I'm doing. I'm now sharing those findings with the public.
Can you describe, I mean, is anybody selected, or how do you get selected for a project of this magnitude?
Well, there were different qualifiers that I can identify. Certainly they were looking for bright children, not necessarily geniuses, but intelligent kids. They were looking for children who were highly psychically active, because some of the most rudimentary forms of time travel occur only in the human mind. They were certainly looking for sturdy children who could endure the time travel that it was expected that we would perform and that we did perform. They were certainly looking for observant children, because we were participant observers in the time probes that we were involved in. And I think generally they wanted kids who were cooperative, who would be easy to work with, from stable, happy households that could be counted on to do what they were asked. But those are some of the characteristics that I can identify from the kids I was working with, who were my team members, and the kinds of activities I was put through to be selected for the project. But in my particular case, it really remains a mystery as to how I was selected. We think I may have been identified by project participants in the future who were in liaison with the project principals that included my father and a number of other engineers and physicists, because my father was essentially approached at work and informed that I would be in the program before I was placed through jumping through all the hoops of being actually selected for the project on my merit. So it was sort of a combination where they were pretty sure I had to be in the program, but they ran me through the loops anyway, the different selection activities they were involving us in, which was everything from IQ tests to tests regarding our ability to see things at a distance, namely engage in remote viewing, clairvoyance, and so forth. So it was a multifactorial selection process. I think fundamentally the thing that they were looking for were gifted and talented American school children that they could rely on to be trained at an adult level for the kinds of time travel activities we were involved in.
Were you sequestered and kept from other children?
Well, I had a very happy upbringing in my family and community, and I certainly had a mainstream educational experience K through 5, certainly in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade when I was secretly being involved in project activities under Project Pegasus. What they were doing is they enrolled us in a learning laboratory that met on Monday, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, and then we would catch up with the schoolwork in our homeroom on Wednesdays and Fridays. That also had the virtue, of course, of when we were sent home on the weekend, we wouldn't be talking about what just happened in the learning laboratory. So we were sequestered in a learning lab at my public grammar school in New Jersey, and then that was used as a location where we were trained. Actually, some of the selection went on there. Certainly the selection for advanced psychic ability went on there. We were given specialized training, both cognitive and psychic and sort of intelligence training, and we were also decanted to defense contractor locations around New Jersey by the fact that they had already sequestered us in this learning laboratory, and they could just take us out a side door of the school into a car to drive us to ITT Defense or Curtiss-Wright or some of the other defense contractors that were part of the program.
Okay, for us that have never experienced that, can you give us a day of what it was like for you? So you would go to school, you'd be in a classroom, and some big guy in black suit would come and get you?
No, there were some big guys from the Navy who showed up in uniform with all of their medals on their chest, so to speak. Sometimes who came to involve us in certain forms of basically psychic time travel in terms of remote viewing. One thing that I can provide the paranormal literature is that remote viewing did not begin at Stanford Research Institute in 1972 with Ingo Swann and colleagues. It was already operational by the fall of 1969, and they were already using children in the program. So that's something that I'd like to clarify. But let me give you one of the more exotic days in terms of the whole amplitude of the project that I think encompasses what was going on. We would walk to school. We would check in at our homeroom. At about 9:15, or 15 minutes after school started, we would walk to the learning laboratory in our school that had construction paper over the window in the door. And there was a facilitator there that we always called the adults who were attached to the project team leaders, which I actually have traced to the atomic research community, that particular phrase. And we would be engaged in a set of activities there. For example, they would involve us in games involving our psychic ability. For example, the teacher would pull a card out of a standard deck of 52 cards and concentrate on it and have us guess what she was thinking. A lot of the time in the learning lab was spent on this form of photo reading on these speed reading devices called tachistoscopes, which had been designed by the Office of Naval Research and manufactured at one of my father's former employers, which was the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey. And we would stare into this machine, and every second a block of text would come into view. I'm talking about as dense as, let's say, a page of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the content was a curriculum called Galileo that covered basically social history and the history of science from the year 1450, which would mark the High Renaissance. They definitely wanted sort of the modern history of Western civilization in our unconscious minds as sort of a resource, I guess, when we were time traveling. If, for example, we had to discern what was going on where they sent us. And I remember being so saturated from those photo reading sessions that I would fall into a dense sleep on an Army field hospital cot that was actually behind the room divider in the learning lab. Other activities that took place there basically involve what I've come to learn in my investigation is basically alpha intelligence training that, for example, the CIA uses to train its field operatives. That includes things like observing things accurately, reporting back accurately what you've seen, communicating to others in a way where you know what's being said, but people overhearing you can't discern what the point of your communication is, and so forth. So we received a lot of that, basically in surveillance, evasion, communicating with others when in captivity, the kinds of things that you would give, let's say, graduates of the military academies and of the intelligence community sort of farms that are used to train intelligence agents. And so we were sort of educated for the project in that context, and then they began taking us to off-campus locations. So on a given day, we might travel by bus. We'd be walked out of the side of the school and be placed on a small school bus and, for example, taken to the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility up in Woodridge, New Jersey, where there was a teleporter that we were trained to jump through, and we'd enter this Vortal tunnel and pop out in Santa Fe, New Mexico. We might then spend the rest of the day in New Mexico, even after dusk had fallen in, let's say, Albuquerque. And then we would be taken over to an identical teleport at the Sandia National Laboratory campus in Sandia, New Mexico, outside of Albuquerque. And we would jump home through a similar but an identical teleporter. But what we soon found is that they were moving us back in time, because it would suddenly be 11 a.m., an hour after we had left originally from New Jersey. We would then be bussed back to the learning lab and be dismissed and walk home. So there were times when my mother gave me my lunch and saw me out the front door, not knowing that I might be spending, hours, days, or weeks in New Mexico secretly before doubling back and walking home that afternoon. So they were essentially using time travel to conceal time travel, and the nexus between our conventional childhood experiences at the school and basically being slipstreamed within the cult of intelligence, being groomed in different forms of time travel, was the learning lab itself, because it was operating on an entirely secret basis.
Okay, let me go back for a moment. I was under the impression that a lot of these psychic programs started with Nazi Germany, Hitler, and they did that with the kids. They started programming them, little kids, even after Hitler was overthrown, and that this Project Paperclip, that they brought this technology over with them, the scientists. Is that true?
No, that's an overstatement. I mean, clearly there were at least 1,000 Nazi scientists, many of them rocket engineers, and other weapons developers that were brought over secretly by the OSS, which of course became the CIA after the war. I must say, though, I spent 3 solid years in real time in Project Pegasus, and ultimately about 4 years when you add in the 4 summers that I spent in quantum displacement in New Mexico, and I didn't encounter a single German accent. And in fact, when you look through the provenance, the provenance of the time travel technologies that I was exposed to, none of them link back to Nazi Germany. So if we begin concluding that the Nazi scientists brought over in Paperclip and things like the Nazi Bell Project were the origin of the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence, we basically engage in historical speculation that ultimately is fanciful. It's just not the case. In fact, Project Pegasus emerged from an intelligence funnel under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that was undertaken in the mid-'60s, and it was certainly pulling data from, time travel theory and practice from the Nazi experience with things like the Nazi Bell. But there were many other sources, and there certainly wasn't any direct connection between Paperclip and Project Pegasus. And we weren't being brainwashed as Manchurian candidates by Nazis within the U.S. intelligence community, far from it. We were being prepared to be the U.S. chrononauts of the future.
So there was no abuse done to children like the super soldiers, no trauma-based type of programming?
There was trauma-based activity pretty much to secure our compliance and to get us to have us conceal what we were being involved in. But it was more in the nature of essentially intimidating us enough to secure our compliance and our secrecy. There wasn't brainwashing, except at the end of our experiences, to forget everything that happened. At least that happened to me. I don't know if it happened to the other 139 participants. But there was no need to induce mind control or entrain our behavior, because they really wanted the opposite from us. When we were, for example, sent to a past time via chronovision, which is this form of holographic-based time travel, they didn't want super soldiers or Manchurian candidates to operate autonomically and sort of as automatons or robots and record what was there. They wanted our full consciousness, our full perception, in all of its dynamism as bright, psychically active children, to go to those locations and gather the best intelligence possible. So while we were brainwashed at the end of the experiences, at least I was, to try to make me forget what I had been involved in, when the project was operational, we were very much in our own minds and hadn't been mind-controlled to gather intelligence. We were actively gathering it with our active mind.
Okay, so let's go back to New Mexico. You jumped through the teleporter, and you go to New Mexico. What did you do when you were there?
We would be involved in a variety of activities. Some of it was just downtime, where I was spending a couple summers there with my dad. First at a rental house in Albuquerque, and then later a rental house up near the Los Alamos Labs, and in White Rock, New Mexico. Some of the things I participated when I was in quantum displacement in New Mexico were time travel related. So they were using time travel to conceal time travel. They were creating a loop within a loop, where we would teleport to New Mexico, be involved in a set of time travel activities there, and then teleport at the end of that summer at that location, teleport back to New Jersey at the beginning of the summer, and then we would live an entirely new summer over again. So one of the time travel activities that I was involved in very extensively, which took place during the first half of the summer of 1971, is they were using the devices called chronovisors to send me back to April 14th, 1865 in the evening in Washington, D.C. at Ford's Theater, where Abraham Lincoln was assassinated that night. And I would be dropped off in the muddy street outside Ford's Theater, talk my way past the ticket table in the front near the door, and then try to work my way up the staircase behind the Lincoln's booth, their balcony seating, to try to be there when President Lincoln was shot, because the task was to get behind his location and see who shot him. Now, what they found when they did that is every time they sent me to that location, something different happened. The large elements, the sort of the things that were destined to happen, still happened. I mean, Ford's Theater was open that night. People were entering to watch a play. It was Our American Cousin starring Laura Keene. The Lincolns arrived. But every time I was run through that past event, small details would change. For example, the same person would cross across me as I walked through the lobby, but instead of talking to one person, this person might be talking to two people. Or the person I confronted who worked there, when I tried to talk my way past the ticket table there, would be a different person. It would be the person who was previously sitting on that person's left. It would be an adolescent, or somebody in their early 20s, or the next time it might be somebody in their 50s. So everything that made that night historically momentous kept on occurring. In fact, one time I actually saw the Lincolns walk across the lobby. I was at a different orientation relative to that event. But many of the small details were constantly changing. So it was kind of like Groundhog Day, where we, at least with chronovision, not so much with the other technologies, they were more sort of linear and connected to this timeline. But they did discover by the middle of the summer of 71 that when they used chronovision to send the same or a different child to the same past event, it was changing all the time. And so they actually shut that part of the program down.
That's fascinating. Okay, so you never saw who shot Lincoln?
I never saw somebody place a gun behind his head or at the side of his head and shoot. I would go up there and the door would be locked, or I'd go up there and I'd be chased away by a Union guard. One time I walked in and stood there, and Lincoln just sat there watching the play, and I left. And, so I basically was asked to identify an intelligence target, and in the case of that exercise, I missed it every time. So I didn't see him being shot. I was downstairs at one point when he was shot, and people just went berserk. They were actually smashing up chairs and things on the floor and against the walls. It was just hideous. There was a huge ruckus that was raised when they realized the president had been shot up in the balcony. But no, I didn't see who shot him, and I don't know whether they were they were using that as a control or whether they were really trying to discern who shot him. One of the theories is that he was shot by Mrs. Lincoln, who was later condemned to a mental hospital, an insane asylum, as it were. So she carried a small little Derringer in her purse, and I think they may have been trying to discern whether the First Lady shot the president and John Wilkes Booth was basically a patsy. He was the leading actor of his time, so he may have gone up there either to get the president's autograph and meet him, or even swap autographs with President Lincoln, because he was a very prominent actor. You know, he was the Paul Newman of his era. So I think they were probably using it as a control. There were a lot of time probes to the past that we did to the time of the Civil War, and my theory there is that they had a 100-year accumulation of data about the Civil War by American historians, so they could insert us into those events knowing the basic factual parameters of the events, because there was so much history having been written about the Civil War. But I really don't know. They may have actually been trying to gather original intelligence about that question.
But didn't you say sometimes the door would be locked? If the door was locked, then how could anybody get to him?
Well, every time I was sent to the Lincoln assassination site on April 14th of 1865, the small details kept on changing. I mean, at one time probe, I would walk up the stairwell and the door would be locked. Another time I'd walk up and I'd be shooed away by a Union guard. Another time I walked inside the balcony and I could see President Lincoln sitting down near the rail of the balcony with his wife on his left, but he didn't get shot. He was shot that night, but I actually was probably chased out. What I'm saying is I never saw somebody pull a gun on him and shoot him. But I did get inside the balcony, as I'd been instructed to do. I just didn't get the actual target they were looking for, which was the act of assassination itself and who perpetrated it. But in the process of doing that, they realized that when they were using these electro-optical devices called chronovisors that generated a hologram that was so dense that it could lens a past or future event in the laboratory, and we were standing on the stage of the chronovisor when it was turned down, and we automatically went to that time and place. And that, in the case of the Lincoln assassination, I was put out in the muddy street outside Ford's Theater and walked in and had to talk my way past the ticket desk there. They discovered that every time they were sending the same or a different child to the same past event, it changed a little bit. So essentially, one of the important things I have to share with the contemporary debate or discourse on quantum physics is that Project Pegasus proved the multiverse. We live in a vast quantum hologram in which the same and similar events are going on multiple timelines. And those timelines can be reached, those alternate timelines can be reached as a result of the development of a device that bends that event into the laboratory.
That's what I was going to ask you, is if you didn't just happen to get on a different timeline where there is different events or different details that are being played out before you.
Well, in the case of the chronovisors, we most definitely were, because they found, they were sending me to a specific location where a specific historical event of great magnitude occurred. I mean, President Lincoln was assassinated that night at that location. And yet every time I even walked to the ticket counter and then walked through the lobby, I was experiencing a slightly different version of that night. I mean, an event in time-space is relative to the observer. There's the old Einstein-Heisenberg dilemma of whether the universe exists and we see it, or the universe exists because we see it. But at the end of the day, whether Einstein or Heisenberg were right in terms of that fundamental dilemma in epistemology and in quantum physics, time-space can only be understood when it's perceived by a human being. I mean, essentially it's occurring in our mind. But what was interesting about this is every time they sent me to the same location, my discrete experience of that event changed a little bit, but only the smaller things. So the things that were sort of destined to happen, that there would be a play that night, that it would be Our American Cousin, that the hall would be packed, and that President and Mrs. Lincoln would arrive, and then he would be assassinated there that night. All those things happened. But as I went back and experienced that event that night multiple times, my discrete experience changed a little bit.
I think I've read where they call those nodes or things. Nostradamus actually talked about that these things have to happen, that they all come together at the same point. They have to happen, but then there can be different realities that spin off of that.
I think another metaphor that I would use is the quantum hologram has a sort of a netting that is somewhat flexible, but fundamentally the netting survives. The space between the netting, however, is variable. And that, I think, nodes is also a perfect concept for that. Essentially, it's almost as if God is imagining all of these timelines into existence, and he knows the basic scenario that he's telling himself, or God might not be a male, let's just say God. So if we conceive of God as the great Imagineer, he's revisiting the same idea over and over again, but filling in the small details, just as we do when we remember anything. I mean, if you were randomly asked to remember any event in your life, let's say a vacation you went on when you were 8 years old, every time you think of that trip, you're essentially going to be re-scripting it in your mind with some slight variation of detail. And that's kind of how these adjacent timelines in the quantum hologram are working. The same events are being played over and over again, but as if they're being remembered with a slight variation of the smaller elements, whereas the overall scenario is not forgotten, it's being replayed. But so that's certainly what I was experiencing traveling to the past in the chronovisors.
Is this where deja vu might come in?
It could be. Another possible explanation that time travel can afford the deja vu mystery is we bank between adjacent timelines. So one possibility is that there's a kink in the membrane between adjacent timelines, and then you kind of bank towards an alternate timeline. And just like film going through a film stock in a motion picture projector, when the loop is righted and you have the time stream that you're in moving forward in a linear way, you then hit that same event again and re-experience it. I think something like that may be going on with deja vu. I think it's a kind of a glitch in the way that the alternate timelines relate to each other that we perceive because we first perceive the alternate timeline and then our own. We're back on track. And that's how it feels, too, isn't it? You feel like you're slightly dissociated, and then you snap back and you suddenly confront what you just confronted. So I think that deja vu does have an explanation that resides in the multiverse.
I got a question from the chat room. What is time coding? I think you mentioned it. What's time coding?
Time coding? God, I've never used that term. I don't know.
Okay. I saw a picture of you. I believe it was in front of the theater, and you don't have any shoes on. Was that the one where you went?
Well, I wasn't in front of a theater. I think you're confusing the over-examined image of the lady walking across the theater in the 1928 Charlie Chaplin footage from the circus. In fact, I think that, let me just say this, I haven't said this before publicly, I think that may have been a disinformation ploy to saturate through dilution my account of a veritable image of a time traveler from the future in a past location. What happened is I was sent to Gettysburg in 1863 from a time lab in East Hanover, New Jersey in the spring of 1972. And right before being extracted from that location, a contemporary photographer from that time took a picture of me standing about 100 paces diagonally away from the dais in which Abraham Lincoln had just arrived to give the Gettysburg Address. In fact, I know it captured him as he was just a few pixels captured President Lincoln right before he arrived, because I had been standing both in front of and to the corner of the dais, and I had attracted so much attention to myself that I intentionally walked away from the dais and was standing in a way where my left foot was forward and my right foot was to the right, and I was looking in the opposite direction from which Lincoln was going to be arriving from the Wills Hotel, because I had been given some grossly oversized adult shoes when I walked into downtown Gettysburg earlier that day barefoot, because my shoes had been wrenched off time traveling to Gettysburg. So that image, which was discovered in 1951, 10 years before my birth, and then published in the early 50s, we believe in Life magazine, although we're having difficulty sourcing that copy of Life, that picture was taken, traveled forward in time, was uncovered in 1951. I was born in 1961. I grew up. I was sent to Gettysburg when I was 10 and a half, and I then completed that event that had already been previously recorded in history. So the significance of that is that what until 2008 was the sole surviving photographs to capture President Lincoln in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the day that he gave his famous address there, is also the first photograph that we know of that captures a time traveler from the future.
So when you went through these portals, how did you dress? Or, I mean, what happened to your clothes? What do you mean they just came off? Your shoes came off?
Well, sometimes we were just wearing our ordinary clothing, like a pair of blue jeans and sneakers and a tailored shirt or whatever, just like kids from 1969, 70, 71 dressed. Certainly not some really loud clothing like something polka dotted or something, but just kind of conventional school clothing. Sometimes when they knew we were going to be immersed in pretty sophisticated social activity, we were given clothing to wear. For example, when they sent me to Gettysburg, I was dressed as a Union bugle boy, and my hat and my shoes and one of my socks were wrenched off on the way to Gettysburg via another form of time travel they were working with called plasma confinement. The times in the summer of '71 in New Mexico when they were sending me to the Lincoln assassination site, I was dressed up kind of in fancy clothing that a kid from the upper crust of society would wear during the Civil War era. Kind of a fancy suit, almost like a Little Lord Fauntleroy kind of velvet suit with a fancy white tie, kind of this lacy kind of tie. And I really didn't like that costume at all. I really liked the Union Bugle Boy costume. So sometimes they would dress us up in period clothing. They had these dressing rooms at some of the project locations that literally had hundreds of different forms of clothing, just like at a movie studio. And we were intentionally dressed. Certainly I was for that Gettysburg trip and also the other one involving President Lincoln. But many times we were just in our street clothing from, 1971 in the United States of America. And if we were sent, for example, to the Dutch countryside in 1800, they really weren't concerned about, making sure that we were in wooden shoes and that type of thing. It was only when there was going to be some kind of social implication of what we were wearing that we were given specialized clothing as kind of a methodology of exploring the past.
Okay, I've seen numerous ways. Peter had a way of time traveling, apparently. We've seen in the movies all these different time travel equipment or contraptions. How really do you time travel? You've told me of 3 ways. Can you count those off so we can all go do research on them?
Yes, certainly. This is a picture of where the actual U.S. time-space program was by 1970. All of these forms of quantum access, or time travel as it were, different forms of time travel, were operational by 1970. The first was simply conventional remote viewing, which is time traveling in the sense that you're putting your mind someplace that you couldn't reach instantaneously physically. And among the things that I was asked to do in conventional time travel, and this involved a lieutenant commander from the U.S. Navy who came into the learning lab, was we were asked to find the location of John McCain, Lieutenant John McCain, in Vietnam. And specifically, we were shown a line drawing of what I later had discerned, or have discerned, was the Hanoi Hilton, the POW compound where he was being kept. And we were asked to determine 2 things, whether he was in that building, and if he was, where he was in the building. So we did participate in some remote viewing exercises of a conventional nature for the U.S. Navy 3 years before remote viewing was supposed to have taken place. The next thing
How
we were involved.
How successful were you guys on that one?
I don't know. We actually were asked to go home and dream about that question for a week and then report back what we had dreamt. I saw them that his captors had dug an earthen hallway on the left side of the compound underneath the foundation, running all the way back to the back of the concrete foundation of the building. And they had him in a kind of a tiger cage over on the left side of that earthen hallway as you walk to the back of the compound. When I revealed that the next Tuesday that we met a week later after we were given that target, one of the girls in the program from another grammar school was jumping up trying to provide the same intelligence data. So I think we had seen the same thing, which is that Lieutenant McCain was placed under the prison, presumably to protect him from U.S. airstrikes as a high-priority American POW.
Wow, that's fascinating.
There was very little of that. One thing we did in that area was they took us up to Hoboken, where where the combat dead were being brought back to an army depot, and we were asked to determine which of the 30 body bags on the tarmac had contraband narcotics in them, in the chest cavities of our combat dead from Vietnam. So there were sort of several military remote viewing exercises like that. Not many. I would say maybe 4 or 5. After we were basically honed to be psychics, because they had already tested and trained us pretty extensively before those naval remote viewing exercises, they began to spin us to induce out-of-body experiences. And I found when I went out of body, there was kind of a physical limit that I couldn't pass spiritually. I would get to almost like a box that I couldn't get around. I'd get to a wall. And that was sort of the limit of the quantum hologram that I found that we live in. And when I reported that back to one of the ladies from DARPA, she said, yes, other people are reporting that. We think it's the infrastructure of the device that's generating the hologram that we find ourselves in. We're calling it the Matrix. So this was a decade before the motion picture The Matrix was released. That physical infrastructure that propagates the hologram that we call the universe was actually detected by the U.S. Defense Technical Community and given the name the Matrix, which in retrospect is astounding. After we had done a lot of psychic, remote viewing and being spun and actually sort of perceiving things of an astral nature out of body, they began placing us in the Montauk chair. The chair that is described in the Montauk series of books by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon exists. And just as Dr. David Anderson reported in 2002, when he said that it went national in the spring of 1970 and involved thousands of American school children, I can testify that that's when we were placed in the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair basically is a magnetic transducer that allows for a form of astral time travel. Essentially, you go forward in time and you pre-experience moments in your subjective future. And if you're then questioned about what you saw when you were out of body after being magnetically induced to see your future, not see you living it, but actually living it as you do within your own brain. In other words, we would actually have like an extended deja vu kind of precognitive set of experiences in the future. And then when we then went unconscious, we would find ourselves back in the chair. So what I asked them, how are we going forward in time with this device if the chair is never leaving this room? And they said, well, we have two theories. Either the magnetic transduction of the Montauk chair allows you to access future experiences in your life that are all stored in your mind when you're born, or it allows you to perceive future events that are stored in waves, time waves as it were, in your environment. But that wasn't, we weren't really seeing ourselves going there. We were going there in terms of our perception. So one time, for example, I saw myself living in Seattle in the future, and when we walked back from the room where the chairs were back to the learning lab, one of the other boys, who now actually is an MD PhD at a distinguished East Coast university, asked me, so who were you this time? And I said I was a lawyer in Seattle. Now that's what I am now. I'm a lawyer in Washington State, and I do a lot of court appearances in Seattle. And at that time, in, let's say, 1970, 71 in New Jersey, I not only didn't have any relatives west of Philadelphia except for one uncle in California, but nobody in my family on either side of any generation living, or deceased for that matter that I knew of, had ever been an attorney. So I don't know how my informing environment would have caused me to imagine that I was destined to be a lawyer in Washington State, but that is in fact what I am today. So the Montauk chair basically prompted your mind to go forward and pre-experience an actual episode of your future. And so then when you were debriefed later, you might be asked, well, was a television set on? And if you said yes, the debriefer would then say, okay, so what was on television? Oh, the president was on television giving a press conference? Who was the president giving the press conference? And in that way, they would sort of derive intelligence findings from that little portion of your own subjective future that you were able to access after going out of body and being prompted to visit the future in the Montauk chair. A more elaborate form of physio-virtual time travel, where we really weren't going there physically, there was certainly a spiritual component, but we were there in a substantial enough way to be seen by human beings and animals in the places we were being sent, was in these devices that I've described called chronovisors. The chronovisors were electro-optical devices that propagated a hologram by driving an electromagnetic signal through a crystal of bismuth, which we now know has a complete proton shell with one additional proton that quantum physicists believe may allow it to sort of bring a future event in through that aperture between the outermost complete proton shell and that one proton, and sort of capture an adjacent timeline in the way that a conch shell would capture sand. Sort of take a slice of the adjacent timeline. Certainly identify the signal of a past or future event, amplify it, and then propagate a hologram of that past or future event in the laboratory. That device was not invented. It was discovered by two Vatican musicologists named Ernetti and Gemelli, who were studying the harmonic patterns in Gregorian chants, and when they were manipulating a specialized microphone to split the signals of the singers in, for example, groups of monks who were chanting in the Gregorian fashion, heard something that Gemelli's father said to him when he was a child that was sort of still in his aura. It was still lingering around in his local environment, actually tagged to him. And they were able to identify the signal of a past event initially and then amplify it, so that by 1952, working in conjunction with the Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, they had developed a two-dimensional flat-screen image of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. And Father Ernetti, who was a very distinguished Catholic prelate, very respected, insisted that that was the case, even up to his death in 1994. Gemelli, of course, would go on to accumulate such wealth that he funded that largest Vatican hospital in Rome that Pope John Paul II convalesced in and ended up dying in. So Ernetti and Gemelli were very prominent Catholic prelates of their generation, and they stuck to their story really into the 90s about the fact that they had found this window to the past. When I was brought into Project Pegasus and I had my first contact with Chronovision in the fall of 1970, I was shown two-dimensional images on television-like screens of past events, for example, of the signing of the U.S. Constitution in 1787. But when we were brought into the Chronovision program, the chronovisor images were already holograms. So you'd come into the auditorium, and if they had one of the holograms up, it looked like a three-dimensional cube of a feature film with utter technicolor. I mean, they were capturing very beautiful scenes of the past because there was great color contrast, and they were sort of gelatinous cubes of light that were hovering in the on the stage of the device. And the first time I saw that kind of image was at the General Manufacturing Company facility in Convent Station, New Jersey, in fall of '70. And then they quickly moved that location to a historical building undergoing renovation in downtown Morristown, New Jersey. And so I visited a Civil War battle that was going on at Convent Station at that location. I remember after that ended, I asked one of the team leaders, how could we be accessing the Civil War, because there wasn't a Civil War battle in New Jersey? And she said, well, we think that event is now over New Jersey, but in another dimension. And the chronovisor is letting us tunnel through to that dimension, so we just basically either placed you in that event or brought the event over you, as it were, so that you experienced a Civil War battle. There was actually a Union sergeant who was waving his sword and yelling at me to get off the battlefield. And I didn't really have time to do so before the Confederate troops advanced, and I jumped under a berm, and the Confederate troops were actually leaping over my location, and I was concerned that one of them was going to stop and spear me with his bayonet, thinking that I was a Union soldier. But in fact, we were told by Jack Pruitt, who was the research director for the Montauk Project, who earlier on Pegasus had just been one of the team leaders, that we weren't really there physically in a way that we could be injured. He used the example of, or the notion that we were spectral presences in their time in the same way that ghosts are a spectral presence in our time, an entity that can be seen but that is fundamentally immaterial in that environment. So I had extensive activity with the chronovisors in New Jersey, and it was a major focus of that summer of '71 in New Mexico. By the summer of '72, they assembled a Stargate, this large black gate-like apparatus. It was huge, on an Olympic-sized basketball court that is at the Cerrillos Cultural Center outside of Cerrillos, New Mexico, which in turn is outside of Santa Fe. And we were running up a ramp and jumping through a a doorway of dense blue light that Stargate was generating to access the year 2045, where we would then pop into view on a pedestrian plaza in a sort of an industrial park area, walk into this beautiful emerald and silver-colored building, and to retrieve data scrolls that were being prepared of sort of summaries of historical events between the early 1970s and the early 2040s. And we were ferrying those back by jumping through a Stargate at that location. We would pop into view on the grounds of the microwave tower at the Lobo Overlook site north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, west of the Continental Divide sign, and then be bussed back to the labs in northern New Mexico. I mentioned the plasma confinement chamber. I really have no understanding of how that worked. I'm really amazed that they were able to fine-tune it so they could intentionally set me down on a road outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on the morning of November 19, 1863, but that's in fact what they did. When that effect wore off, however, we would just sort of experience this massive Kundalini sensation and find ourselves back in the plasma confinement chamber back in East Hanover, New Jersey. And then finally, 10 years after I was in Project Pegasus as a child, I was asked by the CIA to go down to a jump room that was at the building at 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard in El Segundo, California, immediately south of the Los Angeles International Airport. And that device was connected to a similar apparatus on Mars, and I took several short trips to Mars in July and August of 1981. But that wasn't really related to Pegasus. I was just tapped for that. I think because they wanted me to go to Mars and become familiar with what was up there, and because I had teleported as a child. It wasn't really connected to Pegasus. It was under the CIA and Hughes aircraft, whereas everything that Project Pegasus had done was under DARPA and the Ralph M. Parsons Company when I was a kid.
Okay, I have two questions. Number one is, this is really mind-blowing technology. Is
Right.
this technology that man created, or did we get ET help? And number two is, I want you to explain what Mars looks like, and then I got another question about that.
Okay. It's very fashionable to say that human beings are capable of very little, and all this stuff was reversed from down to ET craft. I think Lieutenant Philip Corso's book, The Day After Roswell, which was co-written by Bill Burns, goes a long way to establishing the fact that there has been technology transfer from down to extraterrestrial time ships, as I call them. They're not really extraterrestrials in spaceships. They're really interdimensional beings in time ships. However, when I look back and I reflect on what I was told about the provenance of the different time travel technologies that I just described, I have to say that only one of them is certainly related to the reverse engineering from extraterrestrial craft, and that was the Montauk chair. The Montauk chair was clearly pretty much a laboratory mock-up of the chairs they were finding in the crashed flying saucers, because the extraterrestrial pilots would clearly, moving at a horrendous rate of speed through interstellar space, would have to pilot their craft with their thoughts rather than with some kind of hand-eye coordination. I mean, there wouldn't be time to perceive something and then move a lever or a wheel and control your craft. You would have to pretty much look what was in front of you and then instantaneously think what you should do. So I'm virtually certain that the Montauk chair, as Nichols and Moon have stated, is the result, the provenance of it is extraterrestrial. But the other technologies certainly weren't. I mean, in my investigation into what happened to me in Project Pegasus, I found that essentially the Egyptian mystery school that goes all the way back to ancient Sumer in 3000 BC, indeed, as depicted on a statue of an elephant from ancient Persia around the time of the 7th century BC, humanity has been spinning people, including children, while they're looking at a time tunnel-like image to dissociate them and make them go out of body since before the time of Christ. I mean, literally going back to antiquity. It was being done in ancient Persia, in ancient Sumer, in ancient Greece, and so forth. It's part, essentially, of the Egyptian mystery school tradition, this ancient occult science of using the human mind to discern information from the past and future. So that's been around for a long time, spinning people to induce OBEs. We know the provenance of the chronovisor because, I was taught what it was on Galileo. There were always these chapters about Nikola Tesla, about Ernetti and Gemelli, about the Manhattan Project, and so forth. So we know the chronovisors linked to simply a musicology study that yielded unbelievable results that Ernetti and Gemelli undertook at the Catholic University of Milan in Italy in the 1940s. We know also that the teleporter that was being used in Project Pegasus was in the papers that Nikola Tesla left upon his death in 1943 that were seized by the War Department and forwarded to the physicists that were then gathering in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the atomic bomb. So there again, there's another human contribution to the program. The Stargate technology is a little bit murky. It certainly had some semblance to the Tesla teleportation, but was much more advanced. And they were sending us literally 70 years into the future and safely returning us. There could have been an extraterrestrial component to that, to the derivation of that. Also, we were clearly interacting with project people from the future, so that may literally have been set up in our time by project people in the future. The plasma confinement chamber, I have no idea about the derivation of that, but it wouldn't seem to be an extraterrestrial technology because they were literally basically confining plasma in a lucite chamber, and yet they were able to control its local quantum effect on the teleportee. And then the jump rooms to Mars, I believe, certainly had possibly an extraterrestrial component or derivation because we know that Howard Hughes was involved in these kind of advanced projects before he sort of lost his mind, before his death. For example, he was involved with the Glomar Explorer, which was a huge submersible that was designed to pick up literally a top-of-the-line Soviet submarine that had settled to the bottom of the ocean. I believe that Howard Hughes was also involved in developing the jump room to Mars, and this really, in an incredible coincidence, I found from one of my law clients up here in Washington State who worked directly with and personally for Howard Hughes, that Howard Hughes was in communication with extraterrestrials. Two of them actually showed up at her desk, and she had been tasked by Mr. Hughes to give these aerospace components to two people from outer space that he said were going to show up at her desk in the afternoon. So here in my own law practice, I found an elderly woman who worked with Hughes, and she can corroborate that when she was working directly with him as one of his personal secretaries, he revealed to her that he was in communication with extraterrestrials. So I think when you look at the time travel technologies, it's kind of a muddied picture. I think the best way to conceive of it is that they created this intelligence funnel that they were putting everything they could find into to create a time travel program. So that would include Tesla's works, the works of Ernetti, Gemelli, and Fermi, and that team that developed Chronovision, information from future staff members that they found ways to communicate with and establish a liaison with team members in the future who were, in the United States. Certainly reverse engineered technology from extraterrestrial craft, and things like ancient data from the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian experiments with time travel, and certainly Soviet and other foreign technology, Nazi technology. So I think that we have to avoid either-or thinking because they were really throwing everything they could into their intelligence funnel to enable the U.S. executive branch to have a time travel capability. So they were taking information from wherever they could find it.
Okay, so let's go to Mars. Are you familiar with the Gore report from NASA? Rush commented on it that Mars used to have life, water, oxygen, etc., and that the inhabitants of that area had polluted their environment to the point of where it is now, and now they are here in the United States.
Boy, I've read that. I've actually heard that kind of satire by Rush Limbaugh. I think it was a satire directed at Al Gore and his global warming concerns. I can certainly say, having been up there, that Mars is very arid. Certain areas of Mars are literally littered with ancient statuary, but it is not a planet devoid of life. It has life presently, both human and animal. So I don't really know how to read the Gore report of the famous Rush Limbaugh satire. It could be just a satire of Al Gore in the global warming camp, or maybe it's a sophisticated attempt to create or to surround disinformation about Mars with an ostensibly political theme. I don't know. It's really a little bit of both. He's sort of mocking Al Gore and the idea that the Martian civilization destroyed itself because of their use of the internal combustion engine. At the same time, he states a set of invalid premises about Mars so that the ultimate thrust of the piece becomes a very sort of clandestine form of disinformation. So it's either a very clever attack on Al Gore that was withdrawn from the public because it said too much that was true about Mars, or it was simply removed because people realized that it was ultimately a very superficial attempt to plant untruths about Mars in the public realm. I don't know really which it is, but it's certainly a very bizarre example of disinformation in either way.
Boy, we're lucky that we have somebody like you to help us with the disinformation.
It's very difficult sometimes, yeah.
Forms of time tracking. Forms of time travel is what I really want to say. Future events that you knew about, what did you discover when you were time traveling, and what kind of future events, and what can we expect for the future, if you know of any?
Yeah. When I was time traveling, I was just getting the slice of reality that confronted me, just as when you live your ordinary life in your community. I mean, if you're driving to the bank and there's a car accident on the other side of town, you don't perceive it unless you see it on the evening news. So I was just getting the slice of whatever timeline I was sent to, and a pretty de minimis one at that. I was essentially either being sent to a location to observe something, like the Lincoln assassination, or to pick up data, like the example of jumping to 2045 to retrieve the data scrolls. So virtually everything I learned about the future, except with a few minor exceptions, I learned as a result of being one of the children in the program who jumped through all the hoops and was ultimately involved in the probes to 2045. And I did so in the context of being my father's son. My late father, Raymond F. Basiago, was a senior projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company. Ralph M. Parsons had been one of the lieutenants for Stephen Bechtel during the war. And after World War II, he created his own engineering company, the Ralph M. Parsons Company. And Parsons is essentially the defense contractor that was responsible for giving the U.S. government time travel. In fact, in 1972, after it had done so, Ralph M. Parsons bought the world's largest private yacht from Adnan Khashoggi, the Iranian arms merchant, and renamed it Pegasus II, even though it had never been named Pegasus I, and he had never owned anything called Pegasus except his piece of the U.S. time travel program as it emerged. And so I had my project experiences in a context in which, because my father was a Parsons engineer on the project and essentially the point man between Parsons and the CIA on the theory and practice of teleportation, I was frequently with my dad in New Mexico on a project basis, even when there was downtime when we would share a meal with some of the project principals. So I was able to hear what they were talking about, or I was with my dad when something was shown to him. And so these are the future events that I know the U.S. intelligence community knew about by no later than 1972. I know that I overheard discussion of the imminent resignation of President Nixon as a result of the Watergate scandal. I walked behind two CIA agents who were sitting at a kind of a sandwich bar, kind of a counter, at an eatery in Albuquerque, and one of them said to the other, "So it looks like Nixon gets immersed in a scandal called Watergate and is forced to resign the presidency." And his friend kind of groaned and said, oh Christ. Now, those were gentlemen who were teleporting to New Mexico, spending several years there, and then teleporting back to the day they left. That was called slipstreaming, and that was a way of gathering political intelligence regarding what was going to happen in the next several years. You'd basically create a time loop that you'd send somebody on, have them teleport back to their day of embarkation, and then they could brief the intelligence community on what was going to happen, or at least what happened on that timeline during the next several years. The other thing I know to a personal certainty is that they knew about the advent of the Internet, because John Alexander McCone, who was the director of the CIA from 1960 to 64, and who was Ralph M. Parsons' colleague at Bechtel, as one of Stephen Bechtel's two lieutenants during the development of the Bechtel Corporation, was sitting at one of the restaurants in Albuquerque that we frequented, and he was trying to explain to my father what the Internet was, this future communication system that would evolve in the future. And he was saying, well, listen, Ray, this is basically the reduction to practice of Vannevar Bush's primary fundamental. You sit at something like a rudimentary electronic typewriter keyboard, and you look at a VDT virtually identical from a modern TV set, and through that communication system, you can exchange letters with anybody else in the world who's on the system. And my dad stood up and said, I'm still concerned about this .com thing, maybe it means the commies have taken over by then. Okay, so I know that they were actually talking about this future communication system called the Internet or the World Wide Web. I know that AIDS came up. There was a comment made by Connie Chavez, who was an old friend of my father's when they were watching something in one of the chronovisor arrays outside of Los Alamos. There were these different labs that were secreted in sort of nondescript locations out in the New Mexico desert there. And she said, well, in explaining something they were watching, she said something like, well, isn't there some kind of disease in the future where you have sex with somebody and you die? Okay, so that was their lay understanding of what would be the emergence of AIDS as an epidemic disease. In a more sort of gripping and sort of startling way, there was an incident in which my dad and I were called down from Albuquerque down to Socorro, New Mexico, where there was a C-shaped building that was being operated by the Aerojet Corporation, while simultaneously being described on the campus maps of New Mexico Tech as a student union called Gibbons Hall. But in fact, it was a defense contractor location. And at that location, physics professors and advanced graduate students working under Dr. Sterling Colgate were processing some of the data that we were taking back from the future. A lot of it had been damaged. But they had about a 20-second film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, 30 years in the future. So when we got down there to the Aerojet building in Socorro, we were met by this excited, young physicist from New Mexico Tech who was saying, "We've got it, Ray, we've got it. We've got footage of the domestic Pearl Harbor." And the 9/11 event was also spoken of in those terms. And my dad would often be asked questions by some of the other project people about what that domestic Pearl Harbor called 9/11 in the future entailed, because they had heard about it, but they didn't know what it involved. So they definitely had not only an awareness, but they had moving footage of at least a portion of the attacks of September 11th, whoever perpetrated them. I know they knew about my Mars discoveries because, as I've narrated on other programs, in 1971, my dad permitted me to read my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. My involvement in the public's understanding that Mars is inhabited may, in fact, have been one of the qualifying factors for being selected by the program, because they were trying to train the next generation of scientists and engineers and physicists and so forth. So I know that the data that's in that paper was known to the U.S. intelligence community because I was permitted to read that paper. So everything that's in that 41-page paper was an intelligence finding of the United States government by 1971. How? Well, they were sending people forward in time to retrieve physical artifacts. They were also sending us forward to retrieve historical summaries of future data. So that may very well have been carried back in the data scrolls. I also know, and I think this is probably the most significant thing about the way in which time travel has been covertly used by the U.S. government, that they had definite knowledge of the identities of Presidents Carter, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, because in different ways I learned their names and about their destinies as president during different periods of time on the project and then even later in my life. So we might want to talk about that.
I'm sorry, I was just letting you go. What about the presidents? I mean, you said something earlier, because I would have thought that if the Illuminati or the Bilderbergs or whoever is behind this would find out who the president was going to be and then mind control him, or they would make the president happen the way that they wanted, but it didn't really happen like that. They would find the timeline with that president and then groom him from a child. Is that correct?
Well, see, I'm trying to be apolitical. What I'm doing is I'm sharing what I know, and I'm being honest about what I don't know. What I know is that as a result of the quantum access capability, as a result of the fact that by 1970 they were sending people to the future, they were picking up microfilm summaries of future events, they were bringing books back. They brought my book back when I was a kid on the project. So they're bringing a massive amount of books back that had some kind of social significance and so forth. I know that they had discerned the identity of those 5 presidents, and I can describe how I learned before those individuals were even public figures. In fact, Barack Obama is a contemporary of mine, so he was actually the same age when I was hearing, for example, that somebody named Jimmy Carter would be a president in the future, or this young man named Bill Clinton. What I don't know, and this is really the question that the American people are going to have to answer if they want to rescue the presidency from the CIA and restore constitutional governance in the United States, is having the identity of these modern presidents. What did they do? We know at a minimum they approached them and told them they were going to be president. Now, I know that's the case because in 1970-71 time frame in Albuquerque, my father and I were at a lunch. It was kind of a late lunch, early dinner, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, at which a number of the most prominent project people, like Dr. Harold Agnew, Ivan Browning from the CIA was there, and we had lunch with a large group of people occupying 3 or 4 tables, which included George H.W. Bush, his wife Barbara Bush, mother of President George W. Bush, and George W. Bush himself. So the 3 Bushes were literally sitting right next to me at an adjacent table. And like any 9 or 10-year-old, I was sometimes getting up and just sort of wandering around the restaurant. During one of those wanderings around the restaurant, I was confronted by a 23, 24-year-old George W. Bush, and he had learned my name as one of the kids in the project. He said, "Andy, have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president." He was clearly still under the emotional impress of the information. So I have to conclude that he had just learned as a young man in his 20s that he and his father were destined to be one of the next future presidents of the United States. It didn't seem like he had been brainwashed as a Manchurian candidate since the time he was 5. He seemed to clearly be in possession of his faculties and almost overwhelmed with the information he'd been given. He was making a big joke out of it. I learned about the presidencies of President Carter and Clinton merely by indirect methods, basically secondary sources from within the program. However, I did meet Barack Obama when we were college students. I was taken to somebody's house in West Los Angeles that I was having a conversation with on Bruin Walk. He was a white South African anti-apartheid activist, and he was interested in some of the themes that I was discussing. He said, "Listen, I want to introduce you to my house guest." So we drove in his VW Bug over to a house near San Vicente Boulevard and Bundy Boulevard, that neighborhood over in West Los Angeles, west of UCLA and the Wadsworth VA Center there. And I was introduced to a young Barack Obama who explained to me that he had just spent a year at Columbia, and he was back in Los Angeles visiting his friends from Occidental College, where he had done his first 2 years of college. And we had a kind of a debate, a kind of a voluble discussion about what role the transnational corporations would play in the future, sort of what the significance of them was in political and social terms and economic terms. And we ultimately came to a fundamental disagreement because I was kind of predicting everything that has now happened, where corporations have become the financially dominant players in the world economy. They're destroying the environment. They're driving down wages and so forth. Whereas a young Barack Obama was sort of giving me sort of pat legalistic answers that, well, corporations are a good thing because they allow us to marshal vast human enterprises and distribute liability, remove liability from individuals and so forth. He was sort of describing the corporations as a necessary institution within our modern political economy. So being very politically astute young people, we began to argue. And as the argument sort of fomented, his friend from South Africa turned to me and said, "You better be nice to him, Andy, because he's going to be president of the United States someday." And I said something flippant like, "Well, maybe we'll pitch against each other in the 7th game of a World Series." And Barack Obama smiled and began to walk up the steps inside the house that his host was renting, I take it. And his friend from South Africa actually sort of grabbed my shirt and said, "No, you don't understand." And then he pointed up to Barack Obama. He said, "We know he's going to be president of the United States." So based on all my contact with that theme when I was a child on Pegasus, I have to conclude that the reason that Barack Obama's friend knew that he was going to be president is because Barack Obama had recently been told, and was just like a young George Bush at that age, was so overwhelmed by what he had been told that he was telling his friends, in this case an ally in the anti-apartheid movement. Now, they didn't know that I had spent 3 critical years of my childhood in the very program where those technologies had been derived, and I had been involved directly in the researching of the human side of the use of those time travel technologies. But to the extent that, if Barack Obama had been brainwashed at 10 when he was moved from Indonesia to Hawaii to be a Manchurian candidate 30 years in the future, almost 40 years in the future. I don't think he would have been telling his friends in college or the politically active people he was meeting as an idealistic young college student. I think the reason that his friend from South Africa knew this is because he was probably told when he transferred from Occidental to Columbia and was placed under the tutelage of the man who had just served as National Security Advisor, which was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the director of a seminar program that had 8 students that Barack Obama was placed in when he was transferred to Columbia. It was a seminar on arms control with the Soviet Union. So I think the way to interpret this, Sam, is to say, well, they had developed time travel where they could discern future events, and they were at least operating on the margin of using future information to influence the present by approaching our future presidents and informing them of their destinies, I guess at a minimum so they could psychologically cope with such a destiny.
See, that didn't happen like I would think it would have. It seems like they had pre-packaged or groomed their people to be president and to do their ill bidding, if you will, but it didn't happen that way. It was more of them going into the timeline and finding out who was going to be president, and then they went and would groom that person from a child.
Yeah, well, they would have groomed them from some time. We don't know when they started the grooming. They may have started the grooming when they were in their 20s as sort of advanced graduate students. That might explain why when Dan Rather went in search of where George W. Bush was in 1973, they took his anchor chair at CBS away from him because he was getting very close to the truth. I suspect the truth of the situation, which was that because they had identified George W. Bush as the president from 2001 to 2009, literally the first decade of the 21st century, they probably put him in a seminar program in 1973 to groom him for the presidency. I don't think they were groomed from childhood. But also remember, the American, sort of the members of the permanent secret government, federal science administrators like Dr. Harold M. Agnew, the point man, the defense attaché on Project Pegasus was Donald Rumsfeld. Engineers like my dad, almost to a man, these individuals had served in either World War II or the Korean conflict. So they were, in a sense, super patriots. They weren't illuminists. So I think the way that they rationalized this was, look, we are now able to identify who will be president in the future. Should we start grooming them from kindergarten and kind of raising individuals who might be as arrogant as Roman emperors? Or should we take them after college and give them like a year boot camp on the presidency and let them do their own thing? I think it's more like that. I think that they reconciled the assault upon the Constitution that time travel had made possible with what they perceived as their obligation to protect the democratic processes by which presidents are selected. So I think they've gotten help, but I don't think they're Manchurian candidates. I don't think they were brainwashed about how to behave as president. I think they were given probably specialized education to cope cognitively and psychologically with the presidency. In other words, to have the necessary knowledge base and to also bear up under the tremendous stress of that job.
The only thing that bothers me is, are they invading on our free will at all by grooming them? Because who's to say that they're going to absolutely win? It seems like they're violating us somehow.
Well, we don't know that they were groomed. We know they certainly were approached and told they would be president. But even if they were doing that, I mean, that was not within the contemplation of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. So yes, they're manipulating us in a sense because at a minimum, when those individuals announce for the presidency, they're animated with a winner's confidence, which is what we saw from Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama. They looked like the heir apparent to the presidency right when they began running. I don't think any of the other contenders for the presidency since President Carter have shown the winning confidence that the ultimate winners possessed. Look at how bright a candidate Jimmy Carter was, and then how mediocre and exhausted he seemed by 2 years into his presidency. Look at the beam that Ronald Reagan had. Of course, he was a natural politician. But compare the charisma that, let's say, Obama brought that Bill Richardson and Hillary Clinton and Dennis Kucinich and others didn't bring. The others looked like they wanted to be president, but the winners looked like they knew they were going to be the winner.
Exactly.
So, since
like
we know
when
they
Bush
were told.
started dancing.
Who's that?
Bush Jr. started dancing before, and he said, we're going to win, or he made some comment like that he knew that they were going to win before the votes had even been tallied.
Right, and when we saw the election controversy with Al Gore in 2000, his father was interviewed up in his hotel suite, and he said, "Are you troubled by this turn of events?" And he turned to the cameraman and said, or to the reporter, and said, "No, we're not. We know he wins." He didn't say, "We have faith that our son will win. We have confidence in our son. We have confidence he'll win, and if he doesn't, he'll be a graceful loser." He simply shrugged it off and said, "No, we know he wins."
Yeah.
Of course, that again was a couple bottles of beer talking, because that was the truth of the situation. The Bushes, in fact, knew they were both going to be president when my dad and I met them back at the La Hacienda restaurant in Albuquerque in the early 70s. So at a minimum, the winners have been entering even the primary contests knowing that they're the winners of the general election, and that's wrong. Even if there is quantum access, we should have a reform movement within the intelligence community that keeps that information from future winners, because it's simply unfair. Now, we know where they're doing it. They're doing it because whatever investment they make in the candidate who does win, they don't want to be wasted. They want to, at that point, guarantee that the person wins. So I think the intelligent questions to ask after that are, how far back in their lives are they going to train them after they're told they're going to be president, and what does that training consist of? I mean, we have the absence of Barack Obama from the Columbia University campus when he was a political science major there. The vice president of the Libertarian Party ticket in 2008 was also a political science major of our generation when Barack Obama was at Columbia and I was a history major at UCLA. And that individual polled 80 classmates of he and of Barack Obama, and none of them could even place Barack Obama on the Columbia University campus, much less involved in student government or the school paper or any other kind of politically oriented activity. In fact, he was probably not at Columbia, even though he was given his political science degree from Columbia.
Right.
One place that
Andy, I want to interrupt you just for a moment. We only have 10 minutes left.
Okay.
So I want you to come back because I still have a bunch of questions, but you wanted me to bring up the subject of evidence that you were in New Mexico. And so
Right.
Let's clarify that, and then I'm going to have you come back in January.
Great, thank you. I'd love to be back. Well, we have contemporaneous accounts from individuals I met in 1973 and 1980 that I had just been involved recently in the U.S. time travel program. And what I'm talking about there are individuals whose story I'm going to develop more so in the future. But in 1973 at the Lawrence Junior High School in Chatsworth, California, where I was attending after our family moved to Southern California in 1972 after I was out of Project Pegasus, at least for that time, I told about my activities teleporting back and forth across the country to my honors English class. So I have a list of about 20 people I can remember that was in that class of about 40 people, 30 people. And I'm going to be interviewing them to see if any of them remember whether or not they remember me giving a talk to that class. I have one person who doesn't want to come forward who was in that class who said, absolutely, I remember that. In fact, when I heard you on Coast to Coast, I said, that's the same program Andy was talking about to our 7th grade honors English class. Another person who came forward after I was on Coast in 2009 was Brett Stillings, who he and his father met my father and I camping at Mount Shasta in the summer of 1980. And he remembers not only that my father and I were talking about my involvement time traveling in Project Pegasus, but that there had been reference to a planned teleportation to Mars as something that some of the teleportees at least would be asked to do, and that his father had a slab of this mineral, kind of a rocky slab or a metallic slab of some material called boundary layer material that was actually hovering off the ground. He's also shared the fact that his father, Tom Stillings, was an engineer for Lockheed, and of course my dad worked for Parsons, another very prominent defense contractor. So I'm going to be able to establish by polling that group of 7th grade classmates and by developing Brett's story more fully that my account of serving in Project Pegasus is not of recent fabrication. Now, something that can establish its historicity even more are 3 forms of evidence that would establish that I was in New Mexico before my family crossed New Mexico in November of 1972 when we moved to Southern California. I have 4 surviving siblings. They're older than I. And they have different opinions about my time travel account because most of what my father and I did in the program was concealed from them. So it's sort of odd to have one of your siblings, revealing that your dad was CIA and you were involved in time travel together. But I think that because they're good people and they're honest people, they would acknowledge that their position is that if there's any evidence I was in New Mexico before November of 1972, that would be tantamount to establishing that I teleported there, because they certainly weren't aware of me flying there or driving there or taking a train there. Okay, so what are those pieces of evidence? One of them is almost hysterical in what it consists of. When I was a child, before age 1, my mother was taking me around the block, beginning, let's say, in spring of 1962, as a 6, 7, 8, 9-month-old. I saw a pizza delivery man flip off, show the bird, as it were, give the finger to one of our neighbors because they hadn't given a tip, presumably for delivering a pizza to their house. A couple days later, my father was taking a picture of me and was kind of irritating me. And so I wanted to tell him, you're irritating me. You're making me angry. I'm not enjoying this. Because I had seen the fulmination of the pizza delivery man as he swore and stamped his feet and then gave our neighbors the finger. So as my father was taking this picture of me in the bassinet there in our house in Morris Plains, New Jersey, I lifted up my finger and gave him the bird, not knowing that it was an expletive deleted, just thinking that it was a way in this civilization I'd been born into to tell somebody, back off, you're making me angry, you're irritating me. My father kind of looked after he took the picture, he kind of looked at me from the side of the camera and then kind of had this kind of Tom Hanks moment where he walked, I could hear him going around the house calling for my mother, saying, "You're not going to believe what Andy just did." Okay. Now that picture was in my dad's possession for 10 years. And when we were father and son together on Project Pegasus, he was showing it to his colleagues at lunch at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque, which is where we were frequently eating, namely because it was one of the best Mexican restaurants in the whole state, and still is if they haven't closed it. And he was called away to his next meeting after lunch, and I was tagging along with him, and when he got to the front door of the restaurant, he said, "Oh, damn, that the picture of Andy's still back there." So we went back to all the tables that all the project people were sitting at, and nobody would pull it out of their pocket or reveal where it was. In fact, the picture was lost. Well, that picture is now all over the Internet. It features basically me as a 7 or 8-month-old flipping off the camera. It's a legitimate photograph that I'm going to be able to show based on my other baby pictures that it's me. I mean, I have, for example, pictures that were taken when I was a newborn that are virtually identical to that image. That image is all over the Internet. The people are putting jokes of what the baby's thinking and so forth. But it's not a photoshopped image. It's a long-lost image that my father took and that shows me and that we lost when we were serving on Project Pegasus together. So I'm going to claim the copyright in that photo. I'm going to publish it on my website. I try to share it on more radio broadcasts, maybe get it on some radio program websites, because I want members of the general public to contact me if they know anything about the provenance of that photograph since 1970, because I know it was lost sometime in 70, 71, or 72. I think probably in 72, and I know it was lost at that restaurant because I remember the whole incident. In fact, that's the first time I was shown the photograph. So that's the first thing. We have the photo. It's all, like I said, it's all over the Internet. What we need to know is who put it in the public domain after the early 70s, because by now it's sort of like a stock photograph. If we can trace the provenance of that photograph after it left my father's possession, we can identify the fact that it might trace all the way back to Albuquerque in the early 70s. And my siblings are going to go, well, we have to believe Andy now, because how could a photo of him in our father's possession get to Albuquerque in the early 70s? The second footage that I'm interested in is not a still photo, it's video footage of some kind, probably 16 millimeter film. And it's of a concert that Jose Feliciano gave at an auditorium that seated about 100 people in Albuquerque in the summer of 1971. My father and his friend Connie Chavez and I were sitting immediately to Jose Feliciano's right at a kind of an oblong table. So as the cameraman went behind the performer and photographed him performing to this kind of rectangular room of about 100 people at tables, I was over on that table right on Jose Feliciano's right, about 2 or 3 feet from his guitar. And so if that film footage is extant, that will show that I was in Albuquerque on the project with my dad and his longtime friend, who would be identifiable as Connie Chavez, at a time when I should have been in school in New Jersey. In fact, I should have been enjoying my summer vacation in New Jersey at that time. And then the third piece of evidence is another still photograph. In fact, it's one of those sort of Polaroid snapshots where you have a white border around a square photograph. And that's of a portrait that was taken of myself with Connie Chavez standing behind me with her arms around me, and my father and 2 other engineers from Parsons, one of whom may have been my dad's colleague, Raymond Kubik, who actually introduced my parents before they got married. So those 3 pieces of evidence won't establish that I time traveled, but they'll establish that I was in New Mexico at a time that I shouldn't have been. And if my siblings could step forward and then confirm that they had no knowledge of me literally stepping foot in New Mexico until November of '72, that will go a long way in establishing that I was in a secret New Mexico-based defense project as a child.
Thank you. We have 2 minutes left. Tell people where you're going to be this week so that they can find you. Because I saw it in the chat room.
Oh, I'm going to be at home in Vancouver, Washington, so they can reach me via the website. They can send an email to president.projectpegasus@gmail.com, or just use the email feature at projectpegasus.net. I'm just going to be here catching up on my law practice. It's been a very busy year and a very fortuitous one, because I think I've really turned the tide in terms of public belief about the fact that I've been telling the truth and that Project Pegasus really existed, and that the U.S. government achieved time travel 40 years ago. Because, for example, after I appeared on Coast to Coast AM on November 11th, a poll was taken by George Norrie, and 64% of his listeners believed the case I was making, that the U.S. government was experimenting with time travel and teleportation in the 1960s and 70s, and only 21% disagreed. So I took the yes-no vote by 75%. And so while the Coast audience really isn't demonstrative of the American people, I think ultimately I'm going to win this case, and I think others will then step forward to tell what they know about the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense community back in the early 1970s.
Thank you, Andy. I've enjoyed you so much. I'm hoping that you'll have some open space in January and we can have you come back and finish these questions. Thank you so much.
I'd love to. I mean, I'm sorry we didn't have more time for the chat room, but that kind of presents an overview of what happened. And I think that, if we're successful in establishing this to an historical certainty, then we can go about the business of lobbying the U.S. government to declassify teleportation. And that's going to be one of the things we're going to need to make happen to literally sustain our global civilization. And so that's why I'm driven at this point, really, to get the truth out about the U.S. time travel program.